Thank you very much for the invitation here today, and thanks for everyone being here. I'm very excited to speak to this audience and share with you the work that we've been doing. I'm going to escape from the podium, else I get all restless back there. So I want to start by telling you a little about the brain, and then I'm going to branch into the topic of today's and this entire conference's meeting on games. The brain, the human brain, is the most remarkable structure that we are aware of. It's capable of incredibly rapid processing speed, which enables us to interpret complex information in our environment within a tenth of a second. Over the course of our lives, we'll store approximately 1 billion bits of information, which is 50,000 times the text stored in the U.S. Library of Congress. Despite living in a rather small space, the brain is a massive structure. We have, on estimate, 100 billion neurons in our brain, which is roughly equivalent to the number of stars in the core of the Milky Way galaxy. But what's even more impressive is the number of connections between these neurons, which range in the hundreds of trillions, creating a network of really staggering complexity. But what I want to talk to you today is not about that depth and the complexity of the brain, but this process of neuroplasticity, because this is what's going to relate to the topic that you're all interested in. Up until the 60s, we tended to think of the brain something like this, that it was hardwired, that it was immutable, that it was unchangeable, that you went through a period of development early in life, and your brain changed and adopted, and we're all very familiar with that, the developmental stages of brain growth. And then the brain becomes fixed, and it stays that way through the rest of your life if you're lucky. More likely, it declines to some degree. We don't think this anymore. We tend to think of the brain more like this, that it changes, maybe not jello, but yet that the brain is flexible, it's adaptable. And so the concept of neuroplasticity, simply stated, is the brain's ability to modify both its function and its structure due to changes in the environment, changes in experiences. And this occurs throughout your life. Your brain is constantly changing. This is the essential ingredient of how your brain works. It's a dynamic structure that's constantly reshaping, reforming itself to any new experiences you might have. There's been a lot of interesting research over the years and things that we feel are very important to our brain's growth, things like learning music and learning new languages. I want to point out two interesting examples of neuroplasticity and how we've now come to appreciate the brain's ability to restructure itself, the adult brain, in a way that we never even realized before. So the first is a group of individuals that have demonstrated this tremendous aspect of plasticity. And what I'm talking about are London taxi drivers. Is anyone here from London? Okay, so there are some people. So there is this process in London called the knowledge, gaining the knowledge, and that is taxi drivers go through an intense period of training for on the average of 2 years prior to becoming a taxi driver. They have to go through a very, very detailed examination through the police department at the end of the training, before which they can become a driver. And this entails them being able to quickly and accurately describe the route from any 2 points in the city, which is quite a large and complex city. There was a study done in 2000 which did MRI scans and looked at the structure of the brain in taxi drivers and compared them to non-taxi drivers. And what they found, shockingly, was that an area of the brain known as the hippocampus, you have two of them on both sides of your brain. This is the part of your brain that's responsible for new memory formation. They found that this area of the brain was larger in taxi drivers than non-taxi drivers. And moreover, they found the correlation, and what each of these dots is an individual taxi driver, and they found that the size of this brain region was correlated with how long they'd been driving a taxi, such that those that had been behind the wheel for a longer time had a large hippocampus. Absolutely an astounding finding to find a change grossly on an MRI scan, not just looking at the number of neurons, in a group of people that were in other ways, normal and very much similar to their cohort. But finding this difference in adult brains is quite fascinating. The question was, is this something just different about taxi drivers? The people that go into driving taxis might have better memories in the first place. Maybe this has nothing to do with taxi drivers, right? This is known as the cohort effect. And it's the danger of studying experts and comparing them to non-experts, and that there might be something different about you, not just what you've been doing, but why you became an expert in the first place. So they did another interesting study where they used the control group of London bus drivers. Now, bus drivers spend as much time behind the wheel. They have just as stressful a job, but they do not know the routes as well, right, in all its intricacy. They know a single route, but they don't know how to get from every point to every other point. And they found the exact same finding, that the taxi drivers had larger hippocampi than this group, and they found the same correlation again. Another interesting study has been several, now there's a whole series of these, on juggling. And this is the classic three-ball cascade juggling routine. You've probably all seen this. Does anyone know how to do this juggling routine? So in this study, what they did was they took a group of participants that did not know how to juggle. They did an MRI scan. They taught them how to juggle. Over 3 months, they practiced juggling. They did an MRI scan again. Then they stopped juggling for 3 months, and they did a third MRI scan, and they looked at the different structures in the brain and the shape. And I just want to point out that I was not in this study, nor do I know how to juggle. I just threw these 3 balls in the air. But the participants in this study actually showed an increase in the size, not in the motor parts of the brain, but in the visual parts of the brain, in the visual cortex. This has since been replicated. It actually increases. This is the scan 2, 3 months later. And here's scan 3. Even though a lot of these people actually lost the ability to juggle or on their way to losing their ability, the structure was still larger than it was on day 1. This study was repeated a number of years later and showed that this occurs even after 7 days of practice. It doesn't take this amount of time, 3 months. So it's quite amazing, again, this plasticity of the adult human brain to change its structure. And we have lots of data also showing change in function with practice. What we're asking the question recently, and this is an important question, is can we change our brains to address the limitations of our brain, not just to improve it beyond what might be normal, such as a taxi driver or juggling, or even learning music or how to play a language. So I want to tell you about 3 aspects of our brains that are limitations in our ability to perform optimally, and this has attracted a lot of attention. The first is attention. We know that we cannot distribute our attention infinitely. We have to direct our attention like a spotlight. And you switch your attention and focus it, and that's a strength, but it's also a limitation in that it has a limit on how it can be allocated. Another limitation of our brains is working memory. Working memory is our ability to hold information in mind, in our brain for short periods of time, and then use it to guide our behavior. So the classic example, someone tells you a phone number, you hold it in your mind just to get into the phone. But working memory is what we use all the time. When we engage in conversation, you're holding the train of thought so you can keep it in mind and then respond after another person has. So it's an incredibly basic part of our cognitive abilities, but it's very limited. There are very strict limitations on our capacity to hold information in mind. And the third is speed, processing speed. Although each neuron in the brain processes information very rapidly on the order of milliseconds, as I described before, our brain functions as this vast network. And so with complex operations, there's a lag as information switches between brain regions. And this processing speed is also a limitation of our brain. So the question is, when you have all these limitations in our brain, how does our brain deal with this? Right, so I'm sure most of you are familiar with the things on the screen here. And this is our ever-complicated world that we live in. It's always been complicated. It's probably getting more so. Not just is there an explosion in the media and the devices that deliver that media, a lot of which are now portable, as we're all aware of, but people are using media in a more multitasking fashion. So I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but I can tell you that given the limitations in processing speed, working memory, and attention, when you expose your brain to a lot of information that are simultaneously competing for your resources, you wind up with interference. And our brain is very sensitive to interference. High-level performance declines with even just normal environmental influence on our ability to perform. We've been studying this for many years in our laboratory using functional MRI and electroencephalography, EEG, to look at brain recordings while people are engaged in tasks that we expose them to interference. I'm now going to summarize our last pretty much 10 years of research with just 2 statements. The first is that we found that distraction and multitasking negatively impact memory, both working memory and long-term memory, the ability to hold information for long periods of time. And we've described the neural mechanisms of this effect. Another thing that's quite obvious from our work is that there's a negative impact of interference on memory, and this gets worse as we get older. You're more distractible, and you're more subject to have a negative impact of multitasking while you're trying to do something else. And so these are the papers related to that. I'm not going to talk about any details of this today. I'm just going to use this as a jumping off point for what we're now interested in, which is how can we improve these abilities. There's two main ways that people have gone about trying to improve these abilities that aren't pharmacological, right? So a lot of the industry is invested in trying to change the chemistry of the brain to improve our abilities. The other half of the industry is trying to look at, can we use training and games as a tool to improve abilities? One way would be strategic, where we teach you rules or give you tricks to find your way through a situation that might be challenging, whether or not you have a disease or a condition or just a healthy person. This is a very frequent way that we use to train the brain, and it's been related to things like occupational therapy and even physical therapy. Another way is plasticity-based therapy, and this has several ingredients. It deals with repetition, feedback so that you know how you're doing, and adaptability of the difficulty. So through constant practice in a situation that's becoming more and more demanding as you get better, and you know how you're doing through feedback, we found that our brains can respond very dramatically. And this is using the very basic mechanisms of neuroplasticity that I already described. Video games. Now we know that video games have a lot of those characteristics, not always by design. As a matter of fact, not usually by design. Just through its basic goal of trying to be entertaining, it's dealt with those features of repetition, of feedback, how you're doing, of the games getting more difficult. And there's now some really interesting evidence that shows that action video games improve attention. They improve our ability to resist distraction and the breadth and capacity of attention. So there's a very interesting literature by Daphne Bevalera and her colleagues. If you're interested in this and you search for this last name, you'll find a really growing field that's showing that young adults playing action video games actually have stronger abilities in these domains. The very domains that I already described to you as limitations in our cognitive abilities, attention and interference and processing speed, can all be improved through these type of games. But there's a problem here in a lot of these data. It's the same cohort effect. You take expert game players, you compare them to non-game players, and you ask the question, do video games have anything to do with this? Or is it that people that play video games have different brains, and that's what attracts them to games? The cohort effect. But this group has done a very good job, and others as well, of also doing training studies. In these studies, they take non-video game players, and they have them play these games and compare them to the impact of other games. And what they found, interestingly enough, that even after 10 hours of gameplay, when they compare a first-person shooter game like Medal of Honor to a game like Tetris, they find that this group, the group that plays the games that involve first-person shooting that are more intensive, and I'll go through the features of these games that we think are related to this, this is the group that shows the advantages in their attention abilities, not the group that plays Tetris, although Tetris was often thought of a game that might actually improve these abilities. Now, it's not to say that these games and other games don't have benefits, but in the domains of attention and processing speed and distractibility, it certainly seems to fall very clearly in the domain of the first-person shooter games. How about other games, right? So this is a game. So who here thinks that crossword puzzles are helpful to your cognitive abilities? Okay. Actually, this is what I feel the evidence has most convincingly showed us over time, that there's really, the results of providing no evidence to suggest that the amount of crossword puzzle experience reduces age-related, this is in older adults, this data, age-related decreases in fluid cognition or enhances age-related increases in crystallized cognition. So although a lot of people have an intuitive feeling that practicing crossword puzzles, because it makes you reach into your memory, might have a benefit, the data is actually pretty convincing. I feel that it shows that it doesn't have a lot of benefit. It might be fun. There's no reason not to do it. But if your goals are to improve your memory, it's not very convincing that it is helpful. So here's where intuition might not actually add up with what evidence shows. So it's important to really look at each of these type of interventions in these games and determine what they're helpful for, and then actually direct it in a selective, customized way to those individuals that might want to improve these abilities. So my research over the last 3 or 4 years has moved from the basic science that I described to you. We still do a lot of that, looking at basic mechanisms by which we form memories, by which attention interacts with memories, the impact of distraction and multitasking. But now we figured, can we use these tools of neuroscience to understand how we can improve these cognitive abilities? And so these are challenges that I proposed to my laboratory at University of California in San Francisco, and challenges that I think that the whole field should recognize if we want to really try to use the tools of game technology to really improve cognition. So the first is that we should be using our understanding of how the brain changes in any given condition that we're trying to help to guide the design of the therapeutic intervention, right? So it's not enough to just create something that we think is helpful, but actually target it based on the data of where the deficits lie. The second thing is that the tools that we use to understand the brain, neural recordings, can also be a part of developing, of evaluating and optimizing a game-like intervention or any cognitive training intervention. And the third is that training interventions, these cognitive training programs, can be developed that are engaging, challenging, and enjoyable, that they can be fun, like video games are fun. So this is a very frequent point that I feel is lost, right? The concept of serious games is an amazing one. The games could have benefits outside of entertainment, but they should still be games, right? So I think that that is a part that I see being lost a lot. I feel like we're early in our field, so it's okay. But after a while, I think that we should be returning to the basis of what a game is and trying to capture that in our interventions. So that's a really important point. What I want to do now is take you through some data from our lab and show you examples of all these, at least how we've been starting to implement them in our own research. Another interesting question that I want to return to is this. Can these interventions, so the common expression, I don't know how globally this expression extends, but teaching an old dog new tricks, can these interventions work across all age ranges, right? Is this something that's really only going to have maximal utility in younger adults, where most of the video games have shown their impact? So the studies that I'm going to show you today are looking at healthy older adults, but these general concepts should be able to be applied to any population. So the first question we asked is, will training on a very low-level perceptual ability, discrimination, will it transfer to improvement in working memory? One of the biggest limitations of cognitive training is that it has been shown to not transfer very much. In other words, you get better in what you're practicing, but things that even are related to it very closely don't also improve. And obviously, we don't want to just get better at the things we practice at. We want it to have larger scope and ability to generalize. Also, what happens in the setting of interference, since this is an important question for our high-order performance? So in this experiment of healthy older adults, we did this basic task embedded in a game. I'll show you what the game is in a second. And what they do is see two stripes, a set of stripes that move, and then another one that follows it. So they might move out and then in. And as they get them correct and say out, out, or in, out, whatever they think the pattern is, it gets faster and faster. I'm going to give you an example of this. I'm going to show you a 200 millisecond gap. That means each one comes up for 200 milliseconds, and there's 200 milliseconds in between. That's a fifth of a second. And then I'm going to show you one which is 100 milliseconds, a tenth of a second. Now, our older adults get way faster than that. A lot of them get to the 50 millisecond range. But this is a large room, and you're just looking at this for the first time. So I'm going to show you that. Okay? So what you're going to do is you're going to see these lines moving one after the other, and you have to say how the two directions are. So take a look at this. Everyone see that? So it's an in, an in, out. I'll show you again. Okay, so what this is showing you a very basic discrimination between these moving lines. It activates a very primary and fundamental area of our visual cortex is direction and lines. And this is embedded in a game with different colors, and there's a point system. So it's somewhat fun. I'd say it's a step into being more fun. This would be undoable over any period of time of what I just showed you. It's certainly more engaging. This was a collaboration with a company actually in San Francisco known as Posit Science, which is developing these game-based training programs. So what we found is, what the experiment was, we did training at home for 5 weeks on that game, and we did EEG and a whole host of other tests before and after training in our laboratory. So this was a cooperation between our laboratory and this company which is designing these training programs. So we want to see, do they work, and how do they extend to other abilities, and what are the mechanisms by which they work? So on the game itself, which is called Sweeps, we see that if the training group, so we had 20 older adults that went through the training and 20 older adults that didn't. They just came in before and after. And we see what this bar is the change in their perceptual ability from day 2, the second visit, which is 5 weeks later, compared to day 1. And we could see that there's a large improvement in the training group on this, and there's a very small, actually non-significant practice effect in just having come back twice. And this difference is significant. What we could then do is do EEG recordings where we look at electrical activity while they're playing that game, the sweeps game, and see what's changed in their brain. And so we could look at, this is known as an ERP, an event-related potential. And this is the signal coming from the brain, the visual parts of the brain, after it's been averaged over many trials. And you get these very reproducible waveforms, right? So these are not, it's not EKG, it looks a bit like it, but it's actually a brain wave. This is at onset, and this is only 300 milliseconds, a third of a second after the first stimulus came up. It's this point right here where the two stimuli are overlapping in the brain that we see before and after there's actually a very big change in the size of it. It actually becomes larger after training. But what I want to show you here is that we found this correlation. And what this correlation is that pre-training measures, looking at this, the magnitude of this, predicted how much each individual improves with training. And this is still data that's unpublished. We're now looking at it. But we're fascinated with this ability of using neural recordings to predict how much advantage someone will have by playing a game after the fact. So we could bring someone in, do a profile similar to physical fitness. If you went to a gym and you felt that you needed to be in better physical shape, you might go through a routine, recognize your weaknesses, that you need to be on the treadmill a bit more, you need to be doing this exercise, and then we could tailor-make an intervention based on your weaknesses. So this is the goal of this, is to use this to create a neural profile to predict your performance improvement. Another thing that we found in this study, this part of the study was published, is that we looked at a different perceptual ability. And this is to recognize the direction of moving dots, hold them in mind for very short seconds, just perceptually, and then say, does this direction of moving dots match that? So these arrows wouldn't be here, you just see the dots flow. And interestingly, we find, so the control group is in yellow, the training group is in blue. This is the first visit. This is the visit after training, after 5 weeks. And you can see that they improve. A lower level means that the angle's closer together. That's improvement. If we also look at working memory, your ability to remember the directions of the moving dots in these older adults that went through training or didn't go through training over 7 seconds, amazingly enough, we see that the control group was flat and the training group improved their ability. If you look at the level of younger adults that didn't go through training, you could see that even with just this very small amount of training, they reached the level of 20-year-olds. So these are 70-year-olds playing this game, 60 to 80-year-olds. And you could see that just a small exposure in this game-like environment to this perceptual discrimination training task has led to an improvement in a different task and has led to better memory of also very basic low-level features. So granted, this is what I'd consider near transfer, maybe slightly far transfer because it's a different task. But it's not really showing are they better in the supermarket, which is really the type of questions that we're going to be pursuing in the long run. But it does show the ability of using these tools to understand transfer. If we do EEG on these people before and after, the red means that there's a change in the activity in the back part of the brain. We can see that only the training group shows the change. Green is flat. It hasn't changed at all. And another thing here is that we could find that if you look at the change in visual cortical activity before and after, which is on this axis, and compare it, these are each of the participants, to the working memory accuracy, how much better their memory got, we find that those participants that show this change more robustly improve their memory. So this is really our goal, to understand exactly how it's working by looking at what's occurring in the brain. We can see that as they actually process the visual information less, this actually is a decrease in activity, they remember it better. It seems a little counterintuitive. You tend to think of more activity as doing better, but actually what it points to is an increase in the efficiency of the neural activity, that the neural processes are now more efficient and demand less resources, and so less activity is associated with better memory. We then looked at how this ability changed in the setting of an interruption. So you have to remember these direction of dots and answer it a bit later. And you might be interrupted by a swirl of dots. And you have to say, is this a fast or a slow swirl? And before the experiment, you were told what that is. We find that this training has no improvement in the setting of interruption. So training perceptual abilities led to an improvement in memory, but not in the setting of interference, which is when almost all memories occur, right? It's very rare that you're in a quiet environment with nothing around you that you're actually doing a memory task. You're more likely to be doing it in a restaurant or in a conversation in a busy space. So I think this is an important point. Although these games will have benefits, they will have limitations. And it's important for us to, in a very careful way, find and dissect out all the advantages and the limitations so that we can develop more powerful, more customized, and selective type of interventions. So where do we go from here? Well, we decided to now do an experiment where we didn't just train perceptual abilities, but we trained the ability through a game to deal with interference. And so this is a study that was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation through the Health Games Research Program. I know there are some people here as well that are in this program. This was a remarkable program that funded studies over 2 years to use games for health outcomes. And they funded the research and they funded us, and we're very grateful. It was actually very hard to get research funding, at least from my lab, to do games to do research that looked at the benefit of games on cognition. And this was a collaboration between our lab and video game professionals in the San Francisco Bay Area. A lot of these folks were working at LucasArts at the time. And they helped us design a game, and this is basically how it is that you had to maintain your car on the road using a joystick. It was actually quite challenging. The road's moving all over the place, and signs come up. And while you're driving, you also have to press the button for a correct sign, like a green circle like that, but not for a different sign, like a green pentagon or a blue circle. So it has you multitasking, and it's adaptive. It's constantly getting more challenging. You're actually thresholded before you even play the game on what your level of driving is alone and your sign task alone. And then so the multitasking is not based on your initial abilities. So the older adults in this study play a much slower version, but they're playing it at the same level of performance, at 80%. And then we overlay it, and we see what the impact is. So I'm going to show you some of the early data. We just completed this study. It was a 2-year study. And the goal was to move to a more real-world, more video game-like experience. The game was also designed to be able to be played inside the fMRI scanner and with EEG, so it's very controlled in terms of its timing. So the first data I want to show you is that we could compare what we call the cost, the dual task cost. And what this means is if you look at how well you respond to the signs when you're doing them alone on a black screen, and compare how much worse you're doing on the signs when you're also driving, that's the cost that you take in your ability, right? So that drop, so 0 would mean that you're just as good at doing signs alone as you are doing it while driving. And we could do the same thing with driving. I'm just going to show you one side of it right now for time purposes. And we can ask how this ability changes from 20 years old, 30, 40, 50, 60, up to 70 years old, actually up to 80-year-olds, so 70-year-olds. And so this data is now finished. It's unpublished. We're just preparing this data for publication. And what we found was this, that this ability really declines throughout the lifespan. There's a little blip over there, but it's actually not significant. We see this decline. We see that this is not something that occurs when you're 60 or 70. Actually, if you compare each age group and look at when it's different from 20-year-olds, the difference is over here. This is actually pretty much the steepest part of the curve between 20 and 30 years old, right? So aging is not about being 60. It's about not being 20, right? So this is a lifelong process that we see these abilities changing. So then we have our participants come in the lab, and we ask, how about if we train them on a single task version of the task where they drive and do the signs but separately, or we can overlay them in the version you saw, the dual tasking version. And we do EEG testing in the laboratory. They go home with a laptop. This was actually a collaboration with Apple. We had our participants bring laptops home. They play the game for 12 hours at home, and we used Dropbox so that as they played the game, their data automatically got transferred to our lab. So we could basically see them in our lab server, see them playing in real time at home. And then they come back into the lab, and we see what changes in their cognitive abilities and what changes in their brain. We now have a collaboration that we're working on to have EEG caps where our participants can also, in the next version of this experiment, bring home a cap. So we don't only record their behavioral performance change over time, but we can record how their brain activity changes over time by recording it in their own homes. And now we have a version that we're about ready to receive funding for to do fMRI before and after to look at other changes in the brain. I'm going to show you some very early data on this. This is one of our older participants changing. And what we find is just one piece of data is that the dual task cost, what I showed you before, your ability to do the sign task alone versus how much worse you do when you drive, this is how it changes in the dual task training. So the significant improvement and greater than the group that had as much time on the computer but did the single task training versus a no contact control group that didn't do any training. So you could see that this ability to resolve interference doesn't just require learning how to get better at the sign and the driving task. It requires actually doing them at the same time. You only learn to resolve interference if you put in an interfering environment. So now we're looking to see what other abilities have improved by this, and we're looking at the neural data now to see what is the change that allows you to better resolve interference. So we don't have those data here quite yet. Just one other interesting point of data. This is what the younger adults and older adults in a pilot study, 5 people in each group, look like as they played this game at home for the 12 hours, right? So you could see there's an improvement in their driving ability. They were driving and doing the signs at the same time. You could see the older population also showed an improvement, but the slope is less. And that's been a common finding, that older adults improve these abilities, just not as quickly. But the interesting thing here, and the point of bringing this up, is that we can look at the individual participants and see that there's tons of individual variability here. So here are our younger adults in yellow and our older adults in blue, and we could see that this one younger adult, although she started pretty much at the same level, improved at such a greater rate, just kept on improving, and reached a level that few people, really ever reached. And this older adult over here is just nestled right into the younger population. This is a 70-year-old who started at a higher level and also showed a very similar slope of improvement. So we don't have any idea yet what defines these individuals as being so different. So I think it is a burden of all of medicine to have a more personalized approach, not just look at the populations, but look at the individual differences and try to learn lessons from them. Why are these people so different, and how can we capitalize on those differences in our interventions? Just want to bring home a couple of summary points. We've been thinking a lot about video games and what makes them effective in improving cognition. A lot of these are the data, are the opinions of Daphne Bevallera's group, but they're also opinions that have driven our group in studying this over the years. What we find is that the games that are most effective are the fast-paced, unpredictable games, at least in the type of cognition we're talking about. Games that are engaging, games that have adaptable levels of difficulty, that had feedback, both error messages and motivating rewards, games that are rich and immersive, and I would say the games that are actually challenging these very processes that we know have limitations in our brain. I want to make a little note for neural recordings and the benefit of them, in that it teaches us both the basic mechanisms by which training works, and based on those mechanisms, we can guide more effective interventions by understanding how the brain actually responds, that we could track each individual's progress in a more sensitive manner to know if it's working or if it's not working. That we could customize the training based on neural profiles. So maybe you come into the lab first, do a whole series of tests, and then you leave with a customized set of training package, a program that's really tailored to your strengths and weaknesses. And lastly, there's the ability that brain recording can be used in neural feedback and can be used on sort of a communication between what's happening in your brain, what's happening in the computer in a very adaptable way. I just want to make one pause and point out that plasticity is not always a good thing, right? So maybe not quite as scary as depicted in this picture, but your brain will change to any stimulus in response to anything. So it's important to really understand the basis of how the change is occurring and whether or not it's a change that you want. It's not just enough to say that it's going to change your brain. You actually have to think about these measures. So I think it's a very exciting time, that we're learning now that video games can have a massive impact on our plasticity and our cognition. But this has to be taken in the context of the other things that we know impact plasticity in the brain. So we have a complicated job ahead of us. We know that all of these things impact our brain's plasticity. And so the interaction between the two is our challenge. But I have great hopes for the future in us being able to accomplish this. And I want to thank you for your attention.